My name is Phil McManus. I'm a geographer in the School of Geoscience at the University of Sydney. I specialise in human geography, particularly urban and environmental geography. My presentation is about climate change and the coast and the link between urban and environmental issues. Particularly interested in what happens when climate change, anthropogenic climate change, builds upon other existing issues such as flooding, storm surge, sea level rise and drainage issues around local areas. So my presentation talks about this in the Sydney example and I draw upon historical material to look at what had happened with other moves in Sydney in the past and also around surrounding areas, particularly Lake Macquarie, about equity issues, about procedural justice and fairness issues, which are all part of climate justice issues in relation to urban development and how we'd like to address climate change issues now and for the future. Okay, thank you very much everybody. Just like to start off by saying that the talk this afternoon I think intersects with a few of the talks this morning. Talks about the coastline, the changing coastline and the scientific evidence around climate change. And I'm not going to cover some of those things in the talk. I'm also not going to cover some of the longer term change sort of stuff before human memory, relying upon say physical science, geological science, etc. But the talk definitely does build on those sort of things. So Beach Road, Dulwich Hill, planning urban infrastructure in an age of anthropogenic climate change. Hopefully the various terms in the talk will come evident as we move through. So the first thing is about establishing baselines, and there's obviously been a lot of work here about the history and that we have trouble establishing baselines and it's not quite clear and it's perhaps we have short-term memory about what's gone in the past and forgetting about the baselines. I think there's also a few other issues here, and the key point is it's not simply a matter of better science. If it was simply a matter of better science, we'd probably be doing it by now, and if we didn't actually complete it, we would know what to do. We would know that we need perhaps a bigger machine that goes ping or more funding into this area of research in order to make it work. But usually you find people say, well, we know the science, we just can't implement it, we can't get the social stuff, we can't get the cultural things working. So the paper here is to try and bring this together. It's not to say that the science is completely perfect, it's not there at the moment. It can be developed further, but what's the point in developing science for its own sake if it's not actually resonating with anybody? So there's, I think, a gap between the popular perceptions and the scientific research. They're not in alignment at the moment, and I'll go through some of the issues there. There's also assumption of a unidirectional flow, I think, and hopefully I'll show you that in the presentation in terms of the way in which climate change, the coast, working, that relationship between the coast and the land, and I think there's big issues there. And also think that equity issues are tending to limit the discussion, they're limiting the planning options and climate change adaptation policy, and the solution is not to get rid of equity issues. I think they're paramount and it's a way to work out ways to engage with those particular issues. So I'll take you through some examples of that. You may recognise some of these images. The first one's an album from Australian rock band Midnight Oil, whose lead singer then went on to become the Minister for the Environment and Culture, amongst other things, and had a coastal seat in Sydney, Kingsford Smith. So it's red sails and sunset, Midnight Oil, and you can see the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House there, iconic features, but no water in Sydney Harbour. The one on the right-hand side is from the Powerhouse Museum's Ecologic, and that's modelling a 10-metre rise in sea level at Circular Quay with the Opera House again. So you can see that the Circular Quay, the ferry terminals are gone, and there's water back into the city, if I can find water back into the city buildings as well behind it, and the Opera House down the foreground is above water, but not entirely. So there's certain cultural images I think do, I guess, influence the way in which we might perceive, and the iconic features are part of them. We're not the only country that does that. Here's images from the United Kingdom. The Thames Barrier is an existing structure east of London, and it's preventing flooding on the Thames, and you can see here again around Parliament House and Big Ben and all the other Westminster Cathedral, what would happen if we didn't have these structures. So there's a discursive, I guess, sort of discursive side to this in terms of the image, the power of the image, what it's resonating with, and there's a materiality in terms of an economic cost, that what would happen if flooding did occur, if we did have sea level rise or storm surge. It's not the entire story, but you can see these sort of projections and the way in which they're represented, the way in which people receive these in terms of the media. Now, obviously, people can relate to that in different ways. They don't necessarily receive it the same way, but that's what's being produced. And it's the same in Sydney. I'll just take you through a couple of more recent examples. This was in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2008, and it shows Manly, and the Manly existing up there today. So we don't know, for example, when they say today in 2008, what did it look like 50 years earlier, 100 years earlier, and I think Caroline's paper this morning was really good at pointing that out. But the idea of what it would look like in 2050, fairly simple, raise the water level a certain way. I think certain amount, and I think that's part of the picture, but I also think it's not the entire picture, which I'll come on to afterwards. Various suburbs, this is in 2010, the Sydney Morning Herald again, talking about what's like to happen in Sydney. So what is happening is they're taking often international measurements about sea level rise, average sea level rise throughout the planet, and then applying that logic in Sydney. And that might not be the right amount to use. The amounts might be different. So the Sydney suburbs facing significant danger of inundation, even with limited rises, and they mention a few of the suburbs there. And they're probably some of the suburbs that, if anybody knows Sydney, you'd expect, but also other nearby areas. Significant parts of Newcastle, which is the city to the north of Sydney and the second largest city in New South Wales, 7th largest in Australia, and the Central Coast, which is the area between Sydney and Newcastle, going up places like Gosford and up towards Lake Macquarie, then to Newcastle. But the problems associated with rising sea levels are not limited to coastal areas. So there's some recognition here that it goes back from the coast. It goes into the catchment areas along the Parramatta River. So it's about low-lying areas, threatening homes and infrastructure, and some of the suburbs given here: Homebush Bay, Newington and Silverwater. And for those of you who know Sydney, they're areas that are slightly lower socioeconomic status in some ways compared to the coastal areas. New housing in some of those areas. Silverwater has a prison, amongst other things. Homebush Bay has Olympic facilities. So there's a lot of other, apart from residential infrastructure, that is likely to be flooded if that indeed does come true. And the image is a map of Sydney with a man swimming in Manly Dam. This is a very recent one. It's in September, end of September this year, and it's a response to the IPCC's recent report. And the case here is an 80 centimetre rise in sea levels. I've put the colour in to highlight something. That high tides would regularly flood parts of many Sydney suburbs that are close to water. So they're not just saying coastal suburbs, and some of those suburbs there, Annandale, for example, Marrickville, are not suburbs that are on the coast. They are suburbs that are perhaps low-lying. They're on Sydney Harbour, or they're in areas where the Cooks River, they're susceptible to flooding of some kind. But similar, I haven't got an image for this one, similar to the Manly example, Bondi Beach will shrink to a thin ribbon of sand, and extreme storm surges would reach the top of its concrete walls. So all the sort of past knowledge about when we built the concrete wall, seawall, and tried to establish what is the appropriate height for the seawall, where to place it, all those sort of things, are based upon previous understandings as much as implied threat, but they don't take into account the push of climate change as well. So sea level rise could be expected to be up to 80 centimetres higher by the end of the century. We're talking roughly in about 85 years' time. But there's a concern. Infrastructure, once you start building, whether it's a residential infrastructure like a house, you could expect reasonably that it lasts for 25 years, but often a lot older. I mean, think of your own houses, 50 years, maybe 100 years. And some of this other infrastructure, if it's got heritage value, it lasts for a lot longer time. So what we're doing now is really significant, and that works in many ways. It works in terms of energy conservation and the way we're designing our houses, the way we're orientating our houses, all those sort of things. But it's also where we're positioning our houses and also our cultural infrastructure in relation to vulnerable positions that could result from, and like to result from, climate change. So we have at the bottom here, the bottom part looks like it's just been cut off. Bondi Beach is iconic. It pulls in 1.8 million visitors a year. And they're going to do a new development on it. $7 million North Bondi Surf Lifesaving Clubhouse. But one of the politicians, New South Wales, member New South Wales Parliament, David Shoebridge for the Greens, said the council's own research, which shows that Bondi Beach is set to recede dramatically, and that should be, I think, by about 20 metres and 45 metres, 20 metres in 2050, 45 metres in 2100. The siting of this facility here, according to David Shoebridge, ignores those own plans. So Yes, this is current 2013, but that facility, you'd imagine, is going to be here in perhaps 2050. What will it look like by that stage? Where it will be positioned in relation to the amount of beach, not taking into account things like storm surges and other ways in which that piece of infrastructure could be vulnerable. At the same time this happened, there was the sea level rise by more than 80 centimetres. So bad news for Bondi, which if you're over this way, you're in Bondi at the coast here, and Ashfield, which is in that, just a little bit further in here, near Dulwich Hill, for all the Dulwich Hill fans in the audience. At last, the sign for Beach Road, Dulwich Hill, will mean what it says. Dulwich Hill is 13 kilometres in from the coast. You can see where, point out where Beach Road, Dulwich Hill is. It's nowhere near the beach. Funny if it wasn't tragic. Okay, can you imagine all that area? I mean, that's not likely to flood with an 80 centimetre rise, but imagine some of the other projections, the 10 metre sea level rise, some of those low-lying areas, Sydney Airport, for example, the city centre area, some of these other suburbs here, coastal suburbs, would be in a lot more trouble before Dulwich Hill ends up being flooded. So, as the letter to the editor, Don Smith from Ashfield, pointed out, funny if it wasn't tragic. Is it likely to change behaviour? Well, not in a hurry. We have seen an example of changed behaviour in Sydney before, around the harbour, and I've just shown this image here. It's pulling up one of the, I think, 3 midget submarines, Japanese submarines in World War II that entered, or tried to enter Sydney Harbour, and they did sink some shipping in Sydney Harbour. And there was a change in behaviour in that house prices near Sydney Harbour and some of the eastern suburbs actually fell during the war as people moved out of Sydney, away from Sydney, because of the danger. And it wasn't obviously publicised very much. They didn't want to cause alarm and panic, but people did move to the Blue Mountains and house prices went up in the Blue Mountains. So people did respond to a threat in a particular time, but the threat was sudden and a lot of unknown. Climate change, I think, is not likely to occur in the same way, and if the climate change scenario does result in any sort of movement out, it will certainly be a lot slower than what we saw in the World War II example. What we're more likely to see, I think, is what is actually happening at the moment, in the previous Labor government at the federal level. This is Our Cities, Our Future in 2011, and it's about mitigation and adaptation, and it's to climate change generally, and it's thinking about not just what happens on the coast, but also something else which is obviously very important, which is bushfire risk, and we've had examples in Sydney very recently in the Blue Mountains with the problems of bushfire, the expanding cities sort of blowing up like a balloon in terms of the amount of urban bush interface, and getting into areas which are really hard to fight fires. So there's a whole risk of bushfire, storm surge, sea level rise. They're recognised in the existing literature. And a few details here. Between 26 and 33,000 kilometres of road is at risk in terms of this, throughout Australia, at risk on sea level rise. And that sea level rise, you can see the figures here, based upon 1.1 metres rather than 80 centimetres, which was the earlier IPCC projection. When you model that, you get things like between 1,200 and 1,500 kilometres of rail, up to 8,600 commercial buildings, industrial buildings. But it varies throughout Australia. It varies significantly between states, and depending on what you're looking at, and I'll show you a few examples in a minute. But interestingly, Queensland and South Australia were the states with the greatest overall potential loss. That's the aggregate. But there were significant variations between states and between places within states. It's important to remember. This is the combined replacement value, and you can see what it's composed of in terms of light industrial, the commercial, the residential, and the road and rail. And the various projections, the low projection and the high projection. And yeah, it's pretty much, as I said earlier, South Australia and Queensland having overall the total highest in that area. But if we look at particular cases, you can see that it varies depending on which scenario you introduce. So there is a degree of uncertainty here. And I take the point that Alistair made before. There is a certain degree of pretty much certainty that we're locked into unavoidable climate change, rising temperatures. But beyond that, it's a matter of even the lower, if you take the lower scenarios here and the various scenarios, it's still pretty high. Okay, so that would be the sort of good news scenarios. There's nothing that's down at zero. They're all, the closest you're getting is over here for small impact in places like Tasmania. But obviously relative to the size of infrastructure, etc., it's probably significant in Tasmania as well. Commercial buildings, I'm just going to point out here the Lake Macquarie with the arrow on the left-hand side. It's not residential buildings, but I'll come back to that later in the talk when I talk about some big work that we've been doing in Lake Macquarie. You can see places like Wollongong, Newcastle are some of the suburbs, some of the areas, more so than Sydney, where we have significant amounts of infrastructure under threat. Perhaps ironically, over on this side here with the rail infrastructure, Newcastle, Wollongong, quite a lot of that's to do with the coal ports and the coal being exported, which goes off to places like Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, lesser extent China and India, and is burned in furnaces for generating electricity and contributes to climate change. So there seems to be a ironic, I guess, loop coming back here that those are the sites that are most vulnerable in terms of infrastructure. But let's try and put this into some sort of perspective again internationally, and people have talked about other places, developing countries and future generations. Here's an image of Mumbai, and you can see there's obviously a lot more people immediately affected. You can see some of the images, the water here and the boats and everything. That it's actually that the point about visibility, storm surge, sea level rise is going to affect these sort of places. So the low elevation coastal zone in India, there's roughly 60 million people, I think it is, in that area. In Bangladesh, there's obviously a lot more people, so it's about the same people, but a higher proportion of the population living in the same sort of area. We don't have that same sort of problems in Australia. The other point you can't see here is that the drainage system in a place like Mumbai, when the British engineers did it, they only did it to formal settlements. They didn't do it for informal settlements. So a lot of the people, what we commonly call slums, don't have drainage. So a lot of the issue is not what you see, it's what you don't see, and it's about drainage issues and the directional flow when you get water coming in from places where there's really obviously low coping mechanisms. And sorry, the quality of the slide's probably not quite so high. So some of the initial issues we like to get are more mundane than rising sea levels flooding the iconic structures I showed you earlier in the talk, and they're more inequitable than the flooding of the wealthier coastal suburbs and these iconic structures. I just want to quickly go through the last 5 minutes, example from Lake Macquarie, some work we're doing on. At the moment it's being revised for a publication. You can see that I won't spend too much time reading. Lake Macquarie is the largest city in the Hunter region, about 200,000 residents, and the council's known as being vulnerable to sea level rise for a long time. It's where the predictions for future are increased frequency of extreme storm events, and the council's been amongst the forefront of local government councils in adopting a sea level rise policy. You can see for those on, not sure, Sydney's just down here and Lake Macquarie is to the north. I've deliberately chosen a map here which doesn't have the suburbs named on it in the areas because I'm trying to keep the suburbs anonymous. But this is Lake Macquarie in here, and there's an outlet through to the ocean on this side. So north you have Newcastle and you have other local governments down to the south. So we have an area low-lying with the largest freshwater lake inside there. The community work we did involved 5 techniques. I won't go through them all. The 2 localities where the questionnaire was conducted, and I'm only using 2 of these techniques today, were low-lying, flood-prone areas in Lake Macquarie, Suburb A and Suburb B, and they're very vulnerable to climate change impacts, and we've got over 42 questionnaires, which is not a high number in terms of response rate, but that was also supplemented by other forms of research. When asked if climate change is happening, 48% of the respondents agreed it was, while 31% thought it wasn't. So we're dealing with an older population in many cases, and the demographics of the 2 suburbs are very different. So there's a lot of denial going on. I mean, roughly a third of the people don't think climate change is happening. Okay, how do you then move on to that next step? What do you perceive as the most significant climate change impacts? Well, sea level rise is obviously recognised by about a third of those who do recognise it as being important. Flooding by about a fifth. Heat wave is also high up there. When asked who'd be most affected by climate change in your area, 43% of the respondents thought that it was actually the low income groups, and it's probably a pretty good call, to be honest. It's a pretty good call around the world, I'd say, as well, in that there's very much inequity about who's most likely to be affected by climate change. And at a global scale, it's usually the people who haven't contributed to the causes of anthropogenic climate change. When asked about the barriers to climate change adaptation in Lake Macquarie, remembering this is one council that's at pretty much the forefront of doing something compared to other local government councils, A number of interviewees highlight the cyclical changes in weather and climate, and we've been talking about this over the last few days, as being natural, while others blame people for not being engaged with this issue. So you get the quotes like, storms and floods come and go, it's a natural cycle. I lived here all my life and I don't feel much difference in weather patterns now, and just a lot of people don't believe it, and we saw that about 33% of the survey responses didn't believe it. So there's also the issue about equity and climate change adaptation at the local level. It never was, never will be fair, so what is fair anyway, and trying to identify who are the disadvantaged groups, who do we mean when we use that sort of language. So some people just question that part of the construct to begin with. In terms of some field observations, I think they're fairly influential, quite telling. Suburb A had few houses for sale, more newly built houses and businesses coming into the area, but it's apparent that some of the infrastructure was in the tidal range of the lake and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's characterised as a popular tourist destination with unique coastal location and protected foreshores, and it's fairly clear that this particular area is going to try and do adaptation and protection around that existing infrastructure as a way of solving the problem. Suburb B is very different, that's why we chose the different areas. It's an area of churn in the local housing market. Some streets get a lot of houses for sale. Elevation, building the houses up on stilts, and the planting of local species of vegetation appear to be the main adaptation strategies that were adopted. Local residents were concerned about sea rise, but one person told us they were reluctant to admit it in public because of fear of losing their home values, which was identified by one resident. The train station is about 2 to 3 metres above the ground level, so they recognise even without climate change, this is a low-lying area that when you started to build infrastructure quite some time ago, it's not a new train line, that it was actually, prior to climate change, they did actually start elevating the area. So now we're dealing with an issue where people may not want to talk about climate change because if they do so, they can't sell their house, it costs thousands of dollars. They might be denying climate change very strategically because the cost is coming to these people, and this is definitely a poor area compared to the first area. How do we actually move for that sort of scenario? So in terms of the conclusion, the models of climate change that have been put forward, that 10 metre sea level rise ecologic one, 2.5 metre sea level rise we've seen, the 1.1 metre one that was put forward by the previous IPCC, and the last one, the 80 centimetre rise, they're all important in drawing attention to the issue, but there are a number of concerns I have, or questions I have. They potentially cause confusion and doubt about scientific validity, and I think the point that Alistair made is really important about there is a certain degree of consensus here. Where is the doubt? And it's at the upper level. Sometimes they're too small and the impacts seem insignificant, so why should we worry about 1 degree climate change? Just take off a shirt or something. Too large over a long time frame, and some people think it won't matter because I'll be dead anyway. So how do you engage people when that's the sort of attitude that occurs? These models are often unidirectional and they focus on sea level rise, but what they may miss is those drainage issues, the low-lying suburbs. So it's often the areas that are behind, they don't get the views, they haven't got the wealth and the resources, they've not necessarily got an educated population. They're the people who are actually most vulnerable to some of the issues of climate change, and it's because the drainage issues, not so much the storm surge from the coast. They also overlook equity considerations around house prices for such suburbs and people with perhaps less coping mechanisms having to deal with the brunt of the climate change adaptation. The siting of new infrastructure should take account of climate change scenarios, and it is happening, but you can see the example, that Bondi Beach example, it's a reminder of the challenges in doing so when the local government itself, according to David Shoebridge, is actually not even following their own guidelines about the beach. How do you then deal with other people say, well, I want to be on the beach, I want to get my views. Plans should be made now for the eventual replacement of vulnerable infrastructure, including suitable locations for rebuilding. Don't wait till 20, 30 years' time. If we've got infrastructure that's vulnerable and we need to move it, think about where the next rebuilding of that should go. If we don't do it for 10, 20, 30 years' time, set aside the land, set aside the space to do that, otherwise it won't be there when we need it. In the worst case scenarios, compulsory acquisition may be necessary, and I know that's very contentious, and the site possibly used to protect other less vulnerable infrastructure, because we actually need places in order to protect some of the other vulnerable infrastructure. So those areas that can be saved, part of the cost might be some of those areas where saving them, if it's possible at all, is just too expensive, it's too much to do, and there may be justification saying, well, we've got to sacrifice this little bit here in order to save all these other areas. There's contentious, I know there's a lot of equity considerations, and it should be done very carefully. In saying that, the costs of adaptation are high. I don't think there's any question about that. It should be adaptation are high, not anti. but the long-term costs of failure to adapt will be even higher, and I don't think that's a cost we can afford to bear. So thank you very much. About this in the Sydney example, and a draw upon historical material to look at what had happened with other moves in Sydney in the past, and also around surrounding areas, particularly Lake Macquarie, about equity issues, about procedural justice and fairness issues, which are all part of climate justice issues in relation to urban development and how we'd like to address climate change issues now and for the future. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Just like to start off by saying that the talk this afternoon, I think, intersects with a few of the talks this morning. Talks about the coastline, the changing coastline, and the scientific evidence around climate change. And so I'm not going to cover some of those things in the talk. I'm also not going to cover some of the longer term change sort of stuff before human memory, relying upon, say, physical science, geological science, etc. But the talk definitely does build on those sort of things. So. Beach Road, Dulwich Hill, planning urban infrastructure in an age of anthropogenic climate change. Hopefully the various terms in the talk will become evident as we move through. So the first thing is about establishing baselines, and there's obviously been a lot of work here about the history and that we have trouble establishing baselines, and it's not quite clear, and perhaps we have short-term memory about what's gone in the past and forgetting about the baselines. I think there's also a few other issues here, and the key point is it's not simply a matter of better science. If it was simply a matter of better science, we'd probably be doing it by now, and if we didn't actually complete it, we would know what to do. We would know that we need perhaps a bigger machine that goes ping, or more funding into this area of research in order to make it work. But usually you find people say, well, we know the science, we just can't implement it, we can't get the social stuff, we can't get the cultural things working. So the paper here is to try. My name's Phil McManus. I'm a geographer in the School of Geoscience at the University of Sydney. I specialise in human geography, particularly urban and environmental geography. My presentation is about climate change and the coast and the link between urban and environmental issues. Particularly interested in what happens to when climate change, anthropogenic climate change, builds upon other existing issues such as flooding, storm surge, sea level rise, and drainage issues around local areas. So my presentation try and bring this together. It's not to say that the science is completely perfect. It's not there at the moment. It can be developed further, but what's the point in developing science for its own sake if it's not actually resonating with anybody? So there's, I think, a gap between the popular perceptions and the scientific research. They're not in alignment at the moment, and I'll go through some of the issues there. There's also assumption of a unidirectional flow, I think, and hopefully I'll show you that in the presentation in terms of the way in which climate change, the coast, working, that relationship between the coast and the land, and I think there's big issues there. And also think that equity issues are tending to limit the discussion, they're limiting the planning options and climate change adaptation policy, and the solution is not to get rid of equity issues. I think they're paramount, and it's a way to work out ways to engage with those particular issues. So I'll take you through some examples of that. You may recognise some of these images. The first one's an album from Australian rock band Midnight Oil, whose lead singer then went on to become the Minister for the Environment and Culture, amongst other things, and had a coastal seat in Sydney, Kingsford Smith. So it's red sails and sunset, Midnight Oil, and you can see the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House there, iconic features, but no water in Sydney Harbour. The one on the right-hand side is from the Powerhouse Museum's Ecologic, and that's modelling a 10-metre rise in sea level at Circular Quay with the Opera House again. So you can see that the Circular Quay, the ferry terminals are gone, and there's water back into the city, if I can find water back into the city buildings as well behind it, and the Opera House down the foreground is above water, but not entirely. So there's certain cultural images I think do, I guess, influence